Hello and welcome to this video. This time it's a bit later than usual and for a good reason, because as you probably noticed, we have been working hard on version 2.0 of the Flip Fluids add-on, and to be upfront, we are far from done. Our goal is to push performance and features to the max, and that requires a lot of research, coding, debugging and testing. Yeah. Okay, let's start with some visual examples before we move on to the latest numbers and development updates for Flip Fluids version 1. In the background, you can already see an animation, and that's the first ever visualized simulation from Flip Fluids 2.0. Yeah, let me explain what this is all about. As we mentioned in our last development update, one of the core design features of the Flip Fluids 2.0 engine is a fully sparse domain system. In 1.0, the domain is a static grid that fills the entire domain box. The benefit of this dense domain is that it was simple to implement, but the downside is that this can be an excessive waste of system resources. All of that empty space requires memory and extra computations that harm performance. This is why we always recommend to size the domain in a way that reduces empty space as much as possible. For Flip Fluids 2.0, we are building a smarter domain, a domain that is dynamic and changes shape from frame to frame. And with this new domain system, resources are only used and computed over where the fluid exists. This is what we mean by a sparse domain. Decreasing resources usage in this way will enable you to create larger, more detailed and more complex simulations. In this 2D visualization, you can see that the sparse domain requires about half of the resources compared to a dense domain. But in 3D, the benefits can be larger in certain situations. In 2D, this narrow stream uses about 30% of the domain area, while in 3D only 7% of the domain volume is used. And the savings can improve even more in higher detail and larger simulations. After doubling the resolution, detail and scale of the setup, less than 3% of the domain volume is used. With a sparse domain, you can create a domain box as large as you want, and you will not see any resource penalty from empty space. In this example, it is like you can create a moving domain. A sparse domain doesn't just improve memory usage. There are also huge performance and speed benefits. A dense domain requires traversing a large memory footprint. Accessing memory in RAM is slow, and if there's a lot of empty space, the CPU can spend a long time waiting until there's a piece of fluid to operate on. With a sparse domain, the simulator is only focusing on areas where fluid is existing, and this reduces the amount of RAM accesses and also helps keep more relevant fluid data in the CPU cache. CPU cache memory is so much faster to access compared to random access memory, and efficient cache usage results in a less CPU downtime and increased CPU utilization. Yeah, that already sounds great, and honestly, I can't wait to start using it myself. Okay, meanwhile, we have also continued improving version 1, and here are some updates. Flip Fluids in version 1.8.3 is now available, and this version includes important bug fixes and some exciting new features. A new attribute called UID has been added, allowing for advanced visualization options. And our Compositing Toolkit is now included for the first time and is ready for you to test. The geometry node networks for particle visualization now feature a field for random particle scaling. And the Add Fluid and Add Inflow buttons now have a convenient dual function. New example scenes are available for download, allowing you to take full advantage of our attribute system. I will go into more detail on these points in a moment, but first let's take a look at some numbers. Okay, our sales keep growing, and that's all thanks to you. We have now hit 16,350 sales across all platforms. A huge thank you to all of you. Your support has pushed us from the 7th to the 6th place on the Blender market's all-time bestsellers list. Yes, but more importantly, you're allowing us to continue working on our vision, creating one of the best fluid simulation tools for Blender. And in case you didn't know, with every purchase you also support Blender itself. Yeah, because from day one we have continuously donated a portion of our revenue to the Blender Development Fund. Yeah, and we are proud to support Blender at one of the highest levels available for individual contributors. But it doesn't stop there. No, we also believe in supporting the broader open source ecosystem. That means since 2021 we have been a gold level corporate sponsor for Polyheaven. We are incredibly proud to be able to give back to the communities that make our work possible. Do you realize how strong the Blender community has become? If you haven't already, take a look at the Blender Development Fund pages. We were so inspired that we decided to donate monthly on top of our Blender market contributions. I mean, I make money with free software, and thanks to an incredible community, Blender keeps getting better and better. And this is our way of giving back. It's how we say thank you to the people behind Blender. Oh, and speaking of that, Ryan and I met in person for the first time at the BCon 2024. After all these years of working together, we finally got to meet face to face. An amazing experience that we owe to Blender. And here's another exciting piece of news. We met Amber from the Blender Market team. Amber is the Community and Support Director at Blender Market. And during the Humble Bundle sale, she was working closely with the Humble Bundle team. And she told us that Blender Market Humble Bundle was one of the most successful bundles of 2024. Yeah, think about that for a second. Developing the add-on is only part of our work. Besides programming, we have also completed over 60 bug fixes in recent months. In addition, we have processed nearly 1,000 support requests across all channels. And anyone who has contacted us knows how thoroughly and carefully we respond to each request. Our goal is to ensure that every FlipFluid user has a smooth and satisfying experience when working on their projects. We were also positively surprised by the fact that many users actively engage with our documentation. In total, we recorded over 195,000 wiki page views. This tells us that the community is taking the time to understand our features in depth, and we truly appreciate that. We have also grown steadily on social media. On our YouTube channel has now surpassed 8,000 subscribers, and our Discord community has grown to over 1,100 members. A big thanks to everyone who follows our work and stays engaged. And now let's have a deeper look into what is available for you all right now. Let's talk about a new attribute that has been added to the fluid particles, the unique identifier, or UID for short. You have just seen some examples, and now I'd like to explain what this is all about. This new attribute assigns each fluid particle a unique value. The difference between the UID attribute and the already existing ID attribute is that the ID values are not unique and can repeat. And with the UID, particles can now be individually selected and tracked in geometry nodes or a shader. This is a very simple attribute to understand, but it can be used in complex ways to create incredible render effects that were not possible before. And the motivation for adding this attribute was to explore how the fluid particles could be used inside of Blender's simulation node system. Okay, now just something to make clear: simulation nodes is not being used to run the fluid simulation. Simulation nodes is being used to analyze the baked flip simulation to create new and interesting effects. If you are not familiar with simulation nodes, here's a brief explanation from the Blender manual. Through the use of simulation zones, geometry nodes can be used to create custom physics simulations through nodes. Simulation zones allow the result of one frame to influence the next one. That way, even a set of simple rules can lead to complex results with the passing of time. Okay, now that we have UID attribute, this means you can track each fluid particle and store your own custom attributes on the particles. With the help of simulation zones, you can evolve these attributes over time in any way that you can imagine and then generate custom geometry for specialized effects. But using simulation nodes in this way is not so simple. Actually, and without a firm understanding of geometry nodes, this process of storing and managing attributes can be intimidating and you might not know where to start. But to help you create your own effects, we are working on building a framework of node groups to help hide the complexity of setting up and rendering a simulation node's effect. And while we explore further what can be done with flip fluids and simulation nodes, we'll be creating example scenes and geometry node assets that you can load up and try yourself. So if you have any custom effects in your mind, let us know in the comments. And now let me quickly explain what happens in the example animations. This is a visualization showing an inflow emitting particles tagged with their UID. Here is an inflow emitting an UID every 2000 particles. And this is emitting a UID every 107 particles for a more random number visualization. And here is a simulation node example. Random particles slosh around and then organize to display flip text and then drift away back into randomness. And another simulation nodes example. Particles are given an attribute that stores the minimum geometry proximity to a cylinder. This is visualized in a way that shows the natural vortex shedding motion inside of a flowing liquid. And one more simulation node example. The last 20 particle positions are stored as attributes, and these positions are then joined into curves to show the path of the flow. Here's an inflow emitting into a liquid. And in this example, there's a constrained inflow emitting pulses of velocity inside of a liquid. By the way, a ready to experiment with blend file package for this example here is available for download, and the link is in the description of this video. Alright, hello and welcome to the Compositing Tools. So you need to work with an absolutely new blend file because the Compositing Tools need to load some new materials and shaders and some geometry node networks. On the right side, scroll down to Compositing Tools, and if you open it, you will find a message that tells us that a domain object is required. Let's hit create domain and then scroll down again, and then we see that initializing is required. Click it, and a lot of things happened in the background. Yes, the next thing is adding a camera screen, and that is the same like loading the footage into the 3D scene. Just click this one. You can load a video file or an image sequence or still image. I'm using a drone footage image sequence here. Unfortunately, I forgot to set the time code correctly in the timeline. That's why my sequence is beginning with 90,000. However, that doesn't matter because the add-on automatically detects this and sets the correct frame range for me. I just need to click here in frame all, so I'm in the right frame range in the timeline here as well. And if I'm going to take a look in the preview, then I can see that everything has loaded correctly. What I can also see is that there's that orange circle, and that's a fader object. We can fade the footage on a plane here, and that is because we found out that hard edges can be visible in the final rendering of the fluid surface. So we found out fading it out could be a good idea. What you will also find out is that this is also fitting in the camera view. And if you're going to take a look in the 3D viewport, you will also see that this background is connected to the camera. That means when I move the camera or rotate the camera or anything else, the digital screen will follow it. And that's required because, as example, in this scene, we are using footage with a moving camera, and we will need to track that moving camera. And when our digital camera is moving, of course, the background needs to move with it. Okay, so let's have a look to the other things here. We have some checkboxes for passes that we are going to render. Which passes are available depends on how the scene was set up. As example, actually we cannot enable foam and spray or bubbles and dust because white water is not enabled in the simulator. So we would need to do this here. Enable it, and then these checkboxes become available. Rendering the fluid surface, okay, is also available, and objects or elements is something that need to be added to this list here. We will do that later. And something you can also do here is we could enable the background image here and have control over the opacity. This is interesting when working with shadow catchers as example, and that's the same thing as you can see when the camera is selected. Camera setting here, just a duplicate. Before I go into all the other things here, I will make a quick tracking here. I'm not going to explain how this works. This is something for another tutorial because it would take too long. But something I would like to tell you, if I would go to motion tracking here, let's go to Flip Fluids and Compositing Tools here. Scroll here down to refresh and fix all, and when I click this button, my footage is loaded to the tracking window, and now I can click on frame all, so I'm in the right frame range and can work with tracking what I'm going to do now. Great, I have a solving error of 0.70, what is an absolutely fantastic value. I'd say everything below 1 is good, and I finally just need to set my floor orientation. For this I'm going to select 3 trackers that are nearly to the floor and click floor, and then scene has been set up. I finally need to select the camera object and go to add camera solver constraint, and now I can see that tracking worked really good. And the next thing would be to place the domain object where we need it. But the first thing before doing this, we should save our file. So let's do this now. I will call this one comp revision 0 and directly save incremental. So this is now revision 1. And I'm doing this because it's always good to have a fallback. Okay, so we need to place a domain, and what is important when doing this, basically, these are a few things. The first thing is, of course, we are limited to the domain box, and you should try to keep it as small as possible. Don't try to simulate all of the water you can see here, because this can really become very difficult. But you can size this as big as possible, and something you should keep in your mind is that our digital water, our simulated water, will have not the same reflections like the water in our footage, because our environment, our 3D environment, isn't the same as in the footage. So something you should take care about is shadows and reflections, like you can see here in the footage, will not be visible in our virtual water. The only way to do this would be to have an exact HDRI image of the environment, or to do something like 3D recreation using Gaussian splatting or something like this. But for this tutorial, for this quick introduction, that would be too much. So this is why we should try to keep that domain to not go into anything like shadows or trees from the footage. Another thing that is really important is the bottom of our domain should not be the water level or the floor level, because then we would not have any depths in our simulation. What means if you go to a side view, you need to move the domain along the Z-axis, like this. That's the only way we can have some depths. And of course we need some fluid that is on that level here from the red axis here from this side view. So the way you can add fluid to your scene became very easy with the newest FlipFreeze version, just by clicking the fluid button, because this takes a look to the dimensions of the domain box and places a fluid object that fits into it. Absolutely awesome. And as you can see here, we just need to adjust a little bit the upper face of the fluid object, so like this. Okay, so these are two very important steps you should do. And yeah, I would like to rename both so I can easily find it later. So this is the domain and this is fluid. And I always can click that organize button to organize it in outliner, save it. And the next thing would be something like basic rendering without any objects. So that's what we can do now here in the Compositing Tools. We have all the buttons that are required. You can set the resolution here, you can bake whatever. Let's bake a few frames and then click stop. We cannot see anything because we need to load the frame. And when doing this, we could also enable that auto load baked frames button, so automatically baked frames will be loaded. So this is our fluid here. And yes, let's have a look from the side view. You will find out that the upper part of the fluid is not on the level where we need it. And that's because we are simulating with a low resolution of 65. The only thing that we would need to do here is to increase the simulation resolution, and then this will be more on the level where we need it. However, for the first test, that is not required. Something we will do now is we take a look in the rendered view, and then we will find out, it's gray. Yes, and that's because we do not have any materials actually. And the thing is, with the compositing tools come some special shaders, as well for the fluid surface as for white water particles or fluid particles in general. And the only thing you need to do is you need to click the Apply or Materials button, and then everything set up for you. Yes, that means the fluid object as well as all white water particles have an own material now, and you do not need to do anything. What also happens is that each object has now a few modifiers that are required for the compositing process. So something I would like to tell you here is never remove or rename something from here, because that will result in errors. As you see, it's a little bit gray here, and that's because we would need to to set an environment. Something you could do now is you can play a little bit with the distance of the background object. As you know, you can just move that slider here, and this will have an effect on how this looks in the water. As you can see here, that's something that would not work with the background object. Then the next thing would be to add an environment. Something I would like to recommend is using the HDRI Maker add-on because it has a lot of great HDRI images. But for this scene, I found out that the Polyhaven assets have some great pictures to work with. And if you find something that you like, you just need to drag and drop it into the viewport, and you will see how this changes the way the water is looking. Of course, we need to change some settings so this matches more into our footage. Okay, I think it's a good starting point. And now is the question, how can we fade our fluids with the background? And that's really easy because with the fluid surface, you will find two new empties. One is called fluid surface and one is called surface reflections and footage. And the one that is more interesting now is that one, fluid surface. When I go to the top view, I can move this into our domain object, and from the side view, make sure it's high enough. Exact in this way, I can enable fader, and now the magic happens. We can now use the fader object here to control the way how fading works with our fluid surface. Something where you maybe find out that it is disturbing is the lower part of the simulation. A solution we found out is very good is blending the footage with the fluid surface. With using this slider, we can project our footage onto the fluid surface. Yes, and the result is something like this. We have that find fluid button here. When you click this, the fluid became red. And that's great because this way it's easier to work with the fading effect. Now let me disable that fader for a while because there's something else I would like to show you, and that is what happens when using objects. So let's do this. Add an object like cube as example and move it into the domain. And something really cool is as soon as you add this cube to the render objects list, you will see that a fading effect appears. And that's happening with all objects you add to this list, as well as now the object path is enabled. So by clicking this object will be rendered separated from all other elements. That means whenever you are placing an object into your scene, you need to add it to this list here, otherwise it will be visible in all passes you are rendering. Okay, just keep that in your mind. You have control about this fading effect here. Scroll down in the Compositing Tools and find the Advanced Fader settings. Open this panel and then you will find a list of color ramps. Unfortunately, Blender does not give us a more compact user interface, so we have to live with this actually. You will find the names here: fader, object, speed, domain, footage, and this is actually the object fading, and you can modify this here. And something you could also do is you can enable the fader as well and then work with both the fading with the fader object and with the object's fade. If you have it a little bit too big and you find out it's too near to the domain boundaries, you can activate that domain checkbox and then a fading effect from the domain boundaries will happen and you control that too. Never forget to disable find fluid, otherwise you will render your fluid as red surface. The next question is what happens to white water particles, and for this reason we should start to make a small animation. Make the cube an obstacle. And I found out that the waves are too small and that all appears more like a smaller scale simulation. So while the domain is selected, go to the word settings and scale this much bigger. It must not be perfect or it must not be realistic, but it helps you with your artistic vision. While simulating, there is something I would like to show you. If your waves are too big or if you think it's too splashy, that may be a problem with the speed of your object. Open this panel here. Enable update on frame change. And then you will see how fast this object actually is in the simulation. What happens with our white water particle. And yeah, You do not need to add any fading effects to them because they are using the same fading settings like the fluid surface. Disable the fader and the domain, you'll find out particles became smaller. And when you take a look to the advanced fader settings, you will find some fading settings, particles. And it also works together with the fader here. And it also works with domain fading. Something you could also try to use is the speed settings. So let me disable fader and domain and let me enable speed. Let me also enable fine fluid so I can better see what's happening here. And that is fading depending on the speed of the fluid itself. So this is something you can also set up here with the color ramps. And it can also be combined with fader. You will also find some buttons like velocity and invert, and this is especially for fluid in motion. So if you are going to make a river simulation as example, there would speed not make any sense because in a river there's always speed everywhere. Then you would need to work with velocity, what means acceleration and deceleration, and depending on in which direction the flow of the water is, you need to invert it then, and this is the way it works. But in this scene it does not make any sense to work with this. So something you could also do is when using that footage blending here, you can enable fade footage, and that's why we have that second fading object here. You can control with this fader how strong or how far that blended footage will reach. You will also see that the name of this fader is called Fluid Surface Reflection and Footage, and that's because we are using this as a reflection path actually, but this is not finished, so this is why we do not have any reflection path available at this moment, but we will try to make that available as soon as possible. If your scene is ready for rendering, what means everything has been set up, then it's time to render it. You can render it directly as it is, using our command line tools as example, or using render animation, but I recommend to use batch rendering because it's more stable. And if you are going to enable active passes rendering here, then you will be able to render passes, and you can choose how many instances of rendering happens at the same time, but be careful with this setting because this depends on hardware. And now if you click launch render passes, you will find out that something happens in the background. Render passes creates a blend file for each pass separately and then renders it separately, what means you will have a render folder with a rendering for each pass. I've been using DaVinci Resolve for a long while, and for your info I'm using the studio version that might have some more features like the free version, but for this the free version will work as well, and this workflow should work with any other video editor also. So what you can see here is my footage, and this was a starting point for compositing because I have imported my footage here, made some color corrections and then exported it as image sequence, as I've told you in the beginning of the compositing introduction. So what I would need to do here is just to find my rendered sequences, and I can drag and drop them directly into my media pool. You will see that this is not the example we just worked with. This is the one you have seen in the intro part of the introduction, the vertex. And let's have a look to how these single passes are looking like. So we have the object here, fluid only. The reflections and reflections pass is actually not available. Then there's foam and spray. Yes, and something else called foreground elements. This is something we'll talk about soon. Okay, when all this pass is set, drag and dropped into your media pool, you can go to the timeline. Then you can start placing them in the order of the numbers you can see here. So, and that's the result. Something we could do now in compositing passes is, if we think the quality of the rendering is much better than the footage quality, we could use something like damage filter to make it less good. An idea would be to use JPEG damage, place it here, and play around with the settings. There are many things that could also be done. As example, we could take the foam and spray pass. I'm making a right click, open my Fusion page. Then I will add something like glow. And I could colorize it if I like. And in the final result, it looks like this. So just you to know what this passes rendering is able to do. I think there are so many things that could be done. In the last step, I would like to talk about Z elements here. Import images as elements is something that will work in the still image mode. I will talk about that soon. And then we have foreground elements, background elements, reflection elements, ground objects, something to duplicate objects that are in the list here, and the alignment grid. So the alignment grid is something that can help you with aligning your scene. So something we already did in motion tracking, so we can visible. And we could also add foreground elements, and foreground elements are elements that can be used to hide your water with elements that are in the foreground. So you will see our foreground element here, make it a little bit bigger, and that can help me to hide some parts of the water. And as this is using camera projection, it will integrate smoothly into the footage. A great thing is that you can make a second click on this object, and then there's that fader. And clicking again to have the object and move it together with the fader. If you do not like to see any fading effect, you can just disable it by clicking that F. Exactly the same thing happens with the background element, with the difference that a background element can catch shadows, what is not possible with a foreground element. And if you like, you can make this a shadow catcher with this button. And that's why we can enable and disable the background image here. A foreground element cannot be enabled to be a shadow catcher, as it is for the foreground only, where shadows make not any sense. And then there's a reflection element, what is basically the same thing as the background element, with the difference that it uses a reflective material. And this can be used in scenes where you have mirrors as example, or a window where you need some reflections from your water or objects to see in the footage. And then there's the ground object, and this one plays a special role in some scenes, but this is something for the complete guide video and does not have a place in this quick introduction video. By the way, there can only be one ground object, it's not possible to add a second object. And if you have added any elements, you can enable elements as a pass. And each element, what means the foreground, the background, and the reflection, will be rendered as separated passes and can be used in compositing with your video editor. And then there is that still image mode, what has been using to create our development video scene, as you can see here. And you can see that there are some objects in the list here, and all what you can see here came from that simple image here. This is something I've owned from Big Film. It's a collection of background images, and yes, our compositing tools can be used for some kind of 2.5D animations. And the way this works is really easy. You need to use this image as background, so as a camera screen, and then you need some prepared material. I have been using Photoshop to split all elements in the scene into separate elements. So I have the carpet as an own element, I have the couch as a simple element, and one of the most important things, we have a clean plate with all the objects removed. Again, let me start with a new blend file and let's do all the things again. Create domain and initialize all at camera screen, and you need to load your original image here because you need to find where all these objects were placed in the original image at camera screen, and yeah, there it is. So the first thing you should do now is you should place the camera correctly so the floor is aligned to your image. This is very important because in a later process the compositing tools will create a projection camera, what is a duplicate of the actual camera, and from this point on you cannot change the angle of your camera. And as soon as you have finished, you can enable the still image mode, what makes a duplicate of your camera, called FF Stills Projector, and then that import images as elements button is enabled. Just click it, and then you can load all that elements you have prepared. Check them, import media, and then you will see that all of these will be added to the list automatically. Let me hide the camera screen for a moment. So you can see these elements here. As example, the couch. The couch will only be visible where the couch is in the original image. And of course you have that fading here, what is disabled by default for imported media elements. But if you would like to use it, you can enable it, of course, here. But that doesn't make sense in a still image mode, so let me disable this. And something that is also really cool is while the object is selected, not the fader, the object, you can click the Add Camera Screen button and it will automatically be scaled up to the original. And what I did for our scene is I've been using this and created a 3D object from this. Let me do it in a very quick way, just you to understand how this will work. Now we have a 3D object from a 2D image. The clean plate, again, we can click camera screen to make it as big as possible. And we can now move the camera. The texture will not move with the camera because it's projected from the FF Stills projector. Something you should know as well is if you would like that the object has some reflections as example, you can select them and you can switch between these modes here. You can make this a background element or you can make that a reflection element, and then the node setup will be switched by the add-on. So this is a little bit too dark because we do not have any environment actually. I could try to make the background some brighter here. This is how our development video scene was created. This is how the still image mode is working. I love it because it's so easy to use it, and I hope you love to use it too. Randomized particle scaling is also something new you should take a look into. So I have a simulation here with everything enabled. That means we have white water particles here and we have enabled fluid particle export to have also fluid particles visible. So that means I could now disable the fluid surface object for the viewport so we can see all that particles. And if you take a deeper look into this, you will find out that the scale of the particles are randomized. And that happens using a geometry node network, and you have a quick access to all of these settings when going to the modifier settings. So as example, let's disable this one. Let's take the fluid particles, and as you can see, there is that particle scaling and there's this particle scale randomness, and you can just hold this value here and slide it, and then you can see that all particles will have a randomized scale. Of course, the same happens automatically with all the other settings you have here. As example, let's take a look to the foam. Let's make fluid particles invisible, and as you can see, the foam is also displayed with randomized particle scaling, and you can use this value to change this. We just began to make double functions for our operators. As example, if you are starting with a complete fresh scene, you would create a domain object, and if you would like to add some fluid to it, you would add an object like, let's say, cube, and you would bring it anywhere here, and then you would tell the simulator this is, let's say, inflow object, and maybe you would like to have some fluids to be already there. So something you could do is make a duplicate of the domain and scale the upper face down like this, and then of course you would need to change this type to fluid because there must be only one domain object in the scene, and that's a workflow that we have optimized. Let's take a new scene here and then I can show you what I mean. just make this a little bit bigger, and now you just need to click the Create Domain button. And what you can do next is just click that fluid button and you will find out that there's some fluid already inside. And what you can also do is, while the domain is selected, you can hit the inflow button and then another cube will be added, and that's an inflow. So you can now scale it a little bit smaller, bring it to the top, and here we go. Fantastic. If this is something you like and where you think there could be other options where a double function would make sense, please type this in the comments. For the example scenes, you will take a look into your market account from where you purchased our add-on, and then you will find the example scenes file. Just download it from there. And in the zip file you will find a folder, open it, and there you will find some subfolders. And the one you need to take a look into is the geometry nodes folder, where all the new example scenes are placed. You can now unpack them and work with them in Blender. Like this. This is the example with 3 shapes, and you can see that there's a very big geometry node network, and this file as example uses 3 shapes to be visible as particles when simulating, and you can play around with the colors or with the shapes and take a look how all these things are working. If there's something you would like to see in the future, just type it into the comments of this video and we will try to prepare some example files for you. Okay, and if you'd like to see more from the development in 2024, you'll find smaller development clips that we started creating with each new FlipFluids add-on version. Links to these are also in the video description. And that brings us to the end of this video. We would love to hear from you. Let us know what you think about all these updates, and please keep engaging with us when it comes to feature requests, bug fixes, or support inquiries. Thank you for watching. See you the next time, and goodbye.